This is Great FM. Great FM.
Hello, everyone. You've returned to Great FM with me, Ahalya, your host for the official podcast series from greytHR. Now, if you're just tuning into this podcast, you've already seen the title, so you know what we're going to get into. But this is part 2 of a conversation about the new tax regime that India was recently faced with. Taxes are very complicated, and with the new tax regime coexisting with the old one, we realized that it was actually going to prove to be quite impactful on the world of HR, which is essentially exactly what we discuss on this podcast series. So we had a wonderful subject matter expert, CA Amaranath Ambati, co-founder of Arush India, joining us on part 1. And he has been kind enough to join us on part 2 as well, where we are going to talk about primarily now how the new tax regime actually affects HR professionals all over the country. Hi, Amar. How are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thanks, Ahalya. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. I am eagerly waiting for the session to take over.
I really love the energy and the happiness with which you talk about taxes. Amar, it's not very common, I will say that.
I know, yeah.
Okay, lovely. Well, I think let's resume this conversation again with a foundational question. What do you think are the key areas of the new regime that are going to impact the world of HR in India, and how so?
Very interesting question. So the role of HR comes to the new regime or old regime becomes relevant for tax deduction purposes. So while running the payroll, employer has to ensure that the adequate taxes are being withheld on the salary income, and it is a statutory obligation on the employer that if there is any defaults in withholding these taxes, employer has to pay from his pockets. So it is going to impact the revenue of the employer. That's why HR comes into and plays a very important role. From the law perspective and statutory perspective, there is an obligation on the employer, which is basically HR represents the employer when it comes to payroll or anything with respect to salary income. So HR has to roll out an option to the employee as to which regime he wants to choose, whether it is old regime or new regime. That option should be given to the employee. And once the employee exercises that option, that method need to be applied every month while deducting the taxes, while calculating the taxes and deducting the taxes. And also the government guidelines clarifies that once this option is exercised by the employee, employer cannot give an option for them to change that for TDS purposes during the rest of the year. That means in the month of April, generally the employers will roll out this option. And once the employee chooses the option, again after 6 months, if an employee comes back and says that, no, I have realized that the old regime is more beneficial for me, so I have to change that. The employer cannot allow an employee to change the regime.
Okay. That's a very, very important point to note, I think. I think it's easy to think that, the both of them are existing at the same time, so we'll just figure it out as we go. I guess it's not as simple as that, huh?
That's right.
Okay. And, actually speaking of, I did want to touch upon also some gray areas. This kind of came up even in our conversation during the code on wages. With a new tax regime in place, because it's new, right, just by virtue of that fact, are there any gray areas that HR professionals need to look out for and keep in mind?
In my view, I do not see any gray areas as such because it's been rolled out for the past 2 years, and both employees and employers have got used to the rules or the regulations, whatever concerning this new and old regimes.
Right.
So initially, when this was introduced in Budget 2020, generally budget happens during the last week of January. So when this was introduced, there was no clarity with respect to how this need to be taken up for TDS purposes. How will the employer know which option the employee has chosen and whether he needs to apply the new regime or old regime? That confusion was there. But right after the budget, after the end of the financial year in April 2020 itself, the government came and clarified that the rules with respect to TDS on this new regime. So at this point in time, I do not see any gray areas which are lying in this area, Ahalya.
Okay, well, I guess that is comforting to some degree. We can take that and run with it. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that always intrigued me was I had no idea that two regimes can sort of exist together, because if there's a new one, what is the point of the old one? But I guess I'm curious to understand what the conditions are on which one can opt for the new regime or the old regime. You spoke about this in your first answer, but let's dive into it a little deeper now.
So there are a couple of conditions, like the salaried employees. One, we discussed that they have to opt for this regime, old or new, at the time of TDS itself, where employer will roll out that option.
Right.
However, they have an option to choose, or I would say rather change the regime to old or new at the time of return filing. So in my example, which I said, after 6 months, the employee realizes that he should have changed the regime, the wrong one he has opted for. There is no option given for the employer to change that. However, employee himself can change that at the time of filing the tax return. So that relaxation is still available. So salaried employees have to choose this in the tax return itself. There is no separate form or anything to be filed. So in the tax return, there is a checkbox where they have to opt for whether they can go for they want to go for new regime or old regime. So restrictions apply to business income people. However, today's discussion is restricted to salary. So it is much more simpler for salaried employees. And another important condition is, in order to exercise the new regime, the income tax return has to be filed within the due date. When an employee is filing a belated return, he does not have an option to choose the new regime. He has to mandatorily go for the old regime. Whereas if he is filing the return within the due date, which is generally 31st July, he can opt for the new regime as well. These are the two conditions where the employees have to keep in mind.
Okay. And, speaking of, I also want to understand, do you think this coexistence of the two regimes are actually going to affect the world of HR, Amar, or do you think it's going to be smooth sailing and it's just about a transition period, really?
Yeah, since it has already been 2 years, many HR teams or the payroll teams have changed their systems and processes accordingly. But as you rightly pointed out, initially it was a little bit of challenge, and even now, when the company is growing, when the number of employees are growing, they have to ensure that these options have been rolled out every year. See, if it would have been a one regime, then it is, employer can just adopt that regime and continue the withholding taxes, whatever the processes need to be followed. But now, because there are two regimes and every year the employee can change his regime, there is an obligation casted on the employer to roll out this option every year and then collect the data and then follow the process. If you have opted for old regime, accordingly, they need to apply that and then continue the withholdings accordingly. Of course, I think there are many HR softwares, including greytHR, I have seen. The process is very smooth in greytHR, where once I choose that, then consistently the regime is applied in the greytip portal. So it's a wonderful software as well. And so these are some of the logistics point of view the employer and employers have to take care of this old and new regimes. But when you look from the regulatory point of view, it is very clear. But from a process perspective and HR systems perspective, there have to be some changes which they need to do when they are giving these options to the employer.
Okay, all right, got you loud and clear. And I do also want to point out, we've been saying this is a recent phenomenon because when you look at the world of taxation, right, I think even if something is 2 years old, technically, it takes so much time countrywide for everyone to sort of get on the same page. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah. Any new system or any new process from the tax perspective, it takes time for us to digest. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Including the fact that we still have to pay them. That's something we have to digest as well.
Exactly.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. And I think I do want to wrap today's conversation with this question. This is very subjective and, of course, has many different criteria, as we have learned over the course of this conversation, that need to be considered. But if you were to look at it from a very black and white perspective, which regime would you recommend people opt for and why?
It's a very complex question. That as we have already seen, this completely depends on a case-to-case basis. For you, it may be a new regime is beneficial. For me, it may be old regime. Why I would say is, my exemptions and deductions may be quite different from what you are opting for.
Right.
As I mentioned, a new joinee, a young professional who is working for the first time in his the first job, he may not have any commitments, either housing loans or a tuition fee for children. There may not be much of deductions and exemptions. So in those cases, we can right away say that, okay, new regime is more beneficial for you. Anyway, you do not have those exemptions and deductions.
Right.
So what is the point in paying more taxes or going for an old regime? So he can rather opt for a new regime. But when an individual or an employee is having a lot of exemptions and deductions, I would urge that the employee has to compute the taxes under both old and new regime and then make a conscious call as to which regime is more beneficial. Of course, for withholding purposes, whatever regime he has chosen, that's not final. He has an option to change that at the time of return filing. But what happens is when he's changing at the time of return filing, that means whatever option he has chosen for withholding tax purposes has gone wrong. That means he has paid more taxes to withholding process, which again necessitates for him to file the tax return and get the refund, which may take little more time. He has to wait for till the window opens up for return filing, and once he files the tax return, then the return will get processed and he will get the refund out of it. So could be some cash flow issues. But before opting for the regimes, when the option is rolled out by the employer, calculate the taxes under both the regimes and take a conscious call.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think that was a pretty tangible note to end this conversation on, Amar. I can't thank you enough for sort of simplifying the simplified tax regime for us and really breaking everything down. Now, for everyone listening, part one was all about just, giving us that foundation of understanding what the new tax regime entails, what are the different policies and the key highlights, right, that come under the new tax regime. And part two, this conversation has been all about actually recognizing the impact that it'll have on the world of HR. Thanks so very much, Amar, for your time and, taking us through this, holding our hands through understanding this entire thing. It's been a pleasure catching up with you.
Oh, thank you, Ahalya. Thanks for giving me this opportunity, and thanks everyone for listening to this conversation.
Lovely. Well, everyone, listen to part one, part two, and then you'll feel, a little bit more in control, I think. For now, this is me, Ahalya, signing off on this edition of Great FM. We will be back, of course, with more interesting conversations for the series. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for those. But in the meantime, stay safe and stay happy. Adios.
This is Great FM.